I want to talk about what it would mean to find solutions to these problems of myth and modernity, of modernity and meaning. And I am really keen that we've seen a number of solutions being suggested or hinted at along the way. Put this over here. Oops. Put there. There we go. And that's really kind of what I want to talk about. So I'm going to talk in a second, particularly about a group of people who I see as having tried to produce solutions to modernity, its malaise, and the question of where we can find meaning in this strange new situation where the previous resources have been withdrawn from us. I want to talk about the group, kind of not just the Eranos group who worked on these issues in the middle of the 20th century, but the whole group of associates surrounding them who worked on spiritual literatures, we might call it, on existential literatures, on material that stayed in print for years, some of which were bestsellers for years, which people bought in order to, in the modern situation, answer the deeper questions about meaning and purpose in life. And I want to try and look at what it would mean to be more like them. Right? I think it's fascinating that we study, Jung, or we study Eliade, or we study whoever. We may love them, we may read them, but we don't become them. Right? And it's fascinating, of course, partly about what's expected from us by the university systems or whatever, but it's more than that. Right? So I'm interested in looking at a program in that direction. I want to look back at these thinkers who set up our hopes of meaning and modernity to suggest that we need to, and here I'm telegraphing where I'm going to go with this, recover our constructive creativity for mapping out universal human ways forward. We've heard suggestions today. I'm interested in that sense, that we would be a little bit more creative, a bit more active in making meaning. And also so that we would solve maybe some problems that they didn't always manage to solve. Can we go beyond them? We don't just get another generation, but we get a bit further. So to solve the modern problem, the so what problem, by finding intrinsic value, the sacred, in a world which is uncertain about how it feels about divinity. Right? I think that's an interesting thing. We read old sources and we say, where can we find it? Here's the map, we're going to get to it, and here's God. And that's when half the people these days, an increasingly large number, go, oh, that's nice, but I can't go there with you. Have fun on that journey. Right? For modernity, that's the end of that route. So let's see. Now, having taken some wonderful, bright and fun talks already into account, I'm now going to tell a very grim story. Prepare yourself. Personal anecdote time. I'll have to go see Alan after this. So my father is a great guy. He's sort of a strong-hearted, enthusiastic, tall, strong American man of 68. He's also a scientist. And from his perspective, that means he's a materialist. He believes in the material world as the ultimate reality. He's very strongly bought into kind of evolutionary biology as what best describes the human. And he has a great desire to believe in God, in an afterlife. And he has an enormous response to the beauty of the world. He can remember poetry like no one I've never met. He looks at the sun and suddenly a beautiful piece of poetry comes out and bliss emerges. But at the same time, he really is a kind of a nihilist about the fact that for him there is no transcendence. So he flips between these two extremes. Right? He's caught in that nostalgia for the spiritual, for the ultimate, for the true, the beautiful, the higher. A week ago yesterday, my father's wife of 40 years died on his marital bed, and the two of us helped her on that journey. And he is utterly devastated. But what was most interesting to me about this, almost in my academic self as well as my personal self, was that within 8 hours of that death, he sat down and he said to me, the funny thing is, with tears in his eyes, the funny thing is, I can do grief, but the worst part is that every death in my life is a black spot that progressively rots every joy to come. And later that evening, Luis is like, oh. But it's striking, he's very articulate. And that evening we went home to my family home, and his father, this gets worse, his father who killed himself when my father was 10, also in that same streak of nihilism, also a man sensitive to nature and to poetry. On my grandfather's bookshelf was a copy of William James's Varieties of Religious Experience, and my dad opened it, and I swear to you, the first thing it said was, William James, death is the thing that taints all pleasures, and simply that it exists is already the thing that kills joy. And no lie or fantasy we tell ourselves can ever succeed in shielding us from it. And Dad was like, oh, great, I have to read this. Okay, great. Maybe William James will help me. And I'm thinking, oh God, I'm trying to remember if there's an answer in William James. I kind of don't think so, but oh well, good luck, William. So, and I tell the story because this has very deep personal significance for me in some ways. Now, the odd thing is, looking at my stepmother's body, it's incredibly sad, but in a way I get that's going to happen to me, and I almost don't mind. It's okay. It doesn't hurt me in the same way. It doesn't kill the brightness, but for some it does, and it's linked to him, to the idea that you then look at the trees and so on, and for each one of those trees you say, beautiful, but it's just matter. Beautiful, but nothing more. So I want to look at where we go with that. Here we go. So we need to find meaning in modernity for Dad. Right. And I'm interested in these thinkers who came out in the Eranos era, who kind of found a way between the Scylla and Charybdis, if you like, of not merely doing descriptive scholarship, nor offering a definite prescriptive doctrine, you have to go along with this and join the movement, but somehow got a middle ground between. Nor was it merely a kind of utilitarian well-being therapy for whatever you fancy you want to be. There was something else going on there. Let's go to that for a kind of diagnosis of modernity to Das Gasperlenspiel by Hermann Hesse. Last time I was here, I used Eliade for my diagnosis of malaise and modernity. But this time, I think Hesse's Gasperlenspiel is an interesting one. In this book, Hesse imagines a future society kind of looking back on us now, actually. The future he anticipated, and he's terribly prescient. So in the Glass-Bead game, he talks about the age of the Feuilleton, which I think he's imagining a pamphlet society of little bits of info, magazines, but actually he's also describing the blog, Twitter kind of society we're in now. And he says, since the end of the Middle Ages, intellectual life in Europe seems to have evolved along two major lines. The first of these was the liberation of thought and belief from the sway of all authority. In practice, this meant the struggle of reason, which at last felt it had come of age and won its independence, he goes on to say, from the church. But the second trend against that, independence from church, on the other hand, was the covert but passionate search for a means to confer legitimacy on this freedom, for a new and sufficient authority arising out of reason itself. This was, and he says, the two together was an often strangely contradictory battle for two aims, basically at odds with one another. So we've got individualistic reason versus some sort of legitimate value. And he says this leads to a kind of twilight of civilization. He's, Spengler and everyone is coming out here. He's really a big pastiche of Thomas Mann. But he talks about, in the book, he says the death of culture is what this creates. He's talking about us. Currency inflation, he talks about, interesting. Revolutions against accumulated capital, interesting. Cynical calm and malicious pessimism. And he says of us, their deep need to close their eyes and flee from unsolved problems and anxious forebodings of doom into an imaginary world as innocuous as possible. They face death, fear, pain, and hunger almost without defenses, and could no longer accept the consolations of the churches and could obtain no useful advice from reason. They moved spasmodically on through life and had no belief in a tomorrow. Old age and twilight had set in, the dreary mechanization of life, the profound debasement of morality, the decline of faith among nations, the inauthenticity of art. And this is where it gets personal again. Intellectuals, heroes, or villains, he talks about people who write the literature of that age. He says they reported on, or rather chatted, about 1,001 items of knowledge. Their work bore such titles as Friedrich Nietzsche and Women's Fashions of 1870, or the composer Rossini's favorite dishes, or the role of the lapdog in the loves of great courtesans, and so on. That little bit of humor that Hesse developed in his older age. People heard lectures on writers whose works they had never read and never meant to, sometimes accompanied by pictures projected on a screen. Quite a few celebrated university professors. Oh, Hermann. And for him, as he goes on in the story, this leads to an elite flight into of scholars who work on detailed yet barren history telling, an uncreative nostalgia for the past. That's pretty severe. That's what most of us do with our lives. Right. So then I think back, and I'm interested in this Eranos era of thinkers who did a little bit more than that, I think. They were navigators, they were map makers. They engaged in academic salons that merged that nostalgia with some kind of creative license. They were interested in myth, but not only retrospectively, myth as the ever-renewing and renewable by us fountain of meaning. And I won't go into a history of the Eranos Symposium. You'll have to Google it. There are people here who are so much more knowledgeable about this than me. But it's just interesting to see what comes together to create it. There are sciences involved of psychology, sociology, anthropology, semiotics, the science of myth. Max Muller talks about language and myth as a science. Also, the history of religions, of course, is an emergent field. Henry Corbin, who we'll come back to, Gershom Scholem, D.T. Suzuki, Vandeleur, Louis Massignon, Eliade. And also around that, I think philosophy, people like Paul Tillich, Buber, are deeply inspired by existential and phenomenology, these sorts of movements. And the arts, right? Literature, Hesse. I think C.S. Lewis, oddly, is part of this. In the British side, Barfield, we've heard about. Charles Williams, another inkling, wonderful. And in the States, you've got people like Castaneda. You've got people like Robert Pirsig. There's a huge literature emerging, and visual arts as well, right? Rothko, Pollock, Kandinsky, Mondrian, and now I know Klimt as well, are also engaging in these things. And they really see themselves as taking up a thread from the past and bringing it forward into the future. Eric Neumann talked about Eranos as the navel of the world. Eranos' lakeside scene, garden and house, he says, was inconspicuous and out of the way, and yet a navel of the world, a small link in the golden chain. Right? And I kind of think, as opposed to Hesse's idea of a dark academia, of a dark and barren academia, right, we have an alternative picture of what we're doing, but there's a creativity involved. So were they merely archaeologists, protectors, and interpreters of myth, or productive creators of modern meaning? I just want to suggest a couple of points about what they were doing that was so distinctive and different from what we do, and then just look at how Henry Corbin really shows us this. So I think in what they did, there was a method that's different from what's mostly going on now. One, they used data, real historical or psychological or scientific, some form of real concrete data to cook up ideas. Very important. It didn't just make it up. That's why there weren't just gurus, or they weren't just interpreters. There's something solid there. They also, I think, importantly, use a sort of existentialism, phenomenology, even sort of a structural psychology. Levi-Strauss has lots of different things, but sciences that are, or philosophies that are interested in analyzing the universal, fundamental structures of how we exist. Something that is not culturally specific, not dependent on some natural science, but universal in some fundamental way, as they felt. And they took the data with this fundamental analysis and they turned it into a concrete proposal for a path forward, a hope and a future possibility, based on some new paradigm that we could see or attain through this analysis. Modernity becomes a launching platform, not a sickness unto death, as it sometimes seems now. But above all, I think the Holy Grail, partly, was something that I think we still have trouble doing. It wasn't just a supermarket of ideas, as we often have today in the modern world. There was a kind of a chapel of the sacred because they thought really hard about something of intrinsic value that they located at the center. Something of intrinsic value. It could be all kinds of things, a distinctive kind of experience, Eliada's the sacred, a new assessment of reality itself, a redefinition of where value lies, certain experiences or phenomena or activities, but they had to address the hard problem, not the hard problem of consciousness, but the hard problem of where is value. How do we decide that? Only then can we get anywhere. So I'll end by looking at, if we're going to think of this as our sort of brave new world of what Eranos does, where there's a universal analysis based on hard data of some fundamental features of human nature or consciousness, to which they have a creative license in drawing a concrete map forward, and a sense of the goal, some sort of intrinsic value. You have to do a lot of philosophy, you have to do a lot of thinking to go there, but some addressing of what really could matter and what it even means to think about it. How do we find that in examples? So just as I close, I'm going to give an example from Henry Corbin in his, the great French scholar of Persian Sufism. But he took his study of Persian Sufism and unpacked it into a reflection on the imagination that all humans have accessible to them and what it means to dive in and explore it and indeed reap the rewards of value that we find within. So looking at Suhrawardi, the mystic, Swedenborg as well, he uses in that essay, and the Cambridge Platonists, he does give a universal analysis. These are quotes from him. I intend to treat a precise order of reality corresponding to a precise mode of perception. That's not how most academics write about their analysis of Sufi mystics. That I want to describe the topography of these interworlds in the mind as they have been seen by those who have actually been there. He's not making a claim about there really being angels in those worlds, but he is making a claim about having gone into the experience of the consciousness and mapped it out. He gets from it a redefinition. He says, it was impossible for me, in what I had to translate or say, to be satisfied with the word imaginary. So he can't say these are imaginary worlds because there are value assumptions embedded in that word imaginary, that it's fictitious, it's false, it's mere fantasy. So he gives us a new word, imaginal, the mundus imaginalis. He's trying to change the paradigm. He tries to draw a map to the imaginative power that operates in the mind in a climate. He says the imaginal world is not some sort of fluffy, fictitious thing that the scientist doesn't even know how to make sense of. It's a climate, a realm of dimensions, shapes, and colors, his words. And in it we find a value. Upon it depends the truth of the spiritual sense, leading to a general theory of epiphanic places, offering not invented fictions, but a real presence here and now in another world. And my last use of him to give an example is that he does try to address this issue of where the intrinsic value, the sacred, lies. So he says of modernity's sort of search for intrinsic value, he talks about how the Sufis discover angels in the imaginal world. And he doesn't say they're real, he does say phenomenologically they're experienced as powerful forces. Angels externalize themselves in the ecstasy that they cause, and which forms a part of themselves. When you experience the ecstasy, you're experiencing the angel. And these last words, he's paraphrasing there, but he says here, these last words in ecstasy, which forms part of themselves, seem to me to possess a prophetic clarity, for they have the quality of piercing even the granite of doubt. Dad's granite of doubt, of paralyzing the agnostic reflex, right? That reflex to say, yeah, but it's just matter. He says this is happening in the consciousness, and he's addressing it in those terms. They break the reciprocal isolation of the consciousness and its object of thought and being. Phenomenology is now an ontology. Undoubtedly, he says, this is the postulate implied in the teaching of our authors concerning the imaginal. There is no external criterion for the manifestation of the angel other than the manifestation itself. The angel is itself the ecstasis, or the departure from ourselves that is a change of state. We go into a new state. And this is exactly what the angel, in a sense, is. So, last slide. In that sense of encouraging us to be creative in what we do, as well as concise, encouraging us to look for concrete solutions and to address those hard problems of where value is. So it's not just a supermarket of ideas, but we've got some deeper, more rigorous center. I'm interested in us mapping the way towards regions of experience where fundamental value lies, that are not necessarily grounded in a material, mechanistic, utilitarian account. It's good because it makes people feel better. It's good because, Darwin says, right? Where we're able in the end to point to new philosophies in a world that kind of needs to remake divinity. If the words divine, sacred, heavenly, godly, they don't work anymore, why are we not sorting it out and making new words? And I think that's part of the step forward. I'll leave it at that so Wolf doesn't shout at me.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. Do you see anything of this happening? Are we still mapping the way, or have we taken the first steps?
It's a good question, and I sometimes wonder if I'm a bit of a cynic. And we've heard about... We heard a lot about psychedelics, and I have a lot of friends who are very, very engaged in using psychedelics as steps towards ways forward, at least towards discovering new realms, new forms of experience, new senses of intensity, right? I also have friends who say, okay, I don't want to have to rely on that to get there. And so we're searching in other places. We talk about nature, mysticisms, although I think really interesting from what David's papers have said about it. People often say, oh, I love nature, but I don't really, it just feels like a subjective thing I quite like. So I guess it doesn't matter. So that intrinsic value question is still there. So I think there are places, and I think there's still more work to do, though, to find more and to show the grounding of what's really going on there.
And what are the dark forces that will stop this route ahead?
It's a good question. I mean... One answer is just the continuation of the mechanical, material narrative. Not that that's all wrong. I think it's concretely right in terms of science. But the book I'm working on now is about the idea that matter is a way for people to say, oh, it's just matter, mate. You're just matter, mate. Trees are just matter, mate. But no one's thought really about what matter is. The philosophy, the physics of matter goes much deeper. It is much more interesting than that. So I think fighting that kind of dampening narrative, which actually isn't deeply rooted in philosophical questions, I think is important. And maybe with Hesse, I love Netflix, I love YouTube, but a lot of that stuff really is taking our time up. We should have been writing fabulous novels during the pandemic instead of me watching. I didn't watch cat videos, but I watched.
Let's add the other three speakers and take a break.